Greetings, traveler. You've arrived at a place where time slows down, and the worries of the day begin to fade. Here, we gather to listen to history told not in haste, but in a gentle rhythm meant to calm the mind. Perhaps you're ready to drift into sleep, or perhaps you simply wish for quiet company tonight. Either way, I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time of day accompanies your journey back through the ages? And if you find these soft retellings of the past comforting, a simple tap on subscribe ensures you'll never miss another night's tale. Now, breathe deeply, rest easily, and let us step into the stories waiting just beyond the veil of memory. Tonight, we venture into one of humanity's oldest and most haunting questions, a mystery that sits at the intersection of myth and memory, of water and time. What if, long before the civilizations we know, before the pharaohs raised their pyramids, before Mesopotamian scribes pressed cuneiform into clay, before the first cities we recognize rose from the earth, there existed another world entirely? What if that world, sophisticated and thriving, was swallowed by water, leaving behind only whispers in the stories we tell ourselves when the night grows deep and the ancient parts of our minds remember things our waking selves have forgotten? This is not a story with easy answers, nor should it be. The best mysteries never are. Instead, it is an invitation to wonder, to consider the possibility that the human story is far older and stranger than we have allowed ourselves to believe. It is a meditation on impermanence, on the way water reshapes everything it touches, and on the stubborn persistence of memory even when all physical traces have been erased. Let us begin where all flood stories begin, with water itself. Water, that most essential and most destructive of elements. Water, which gives life and takes it away with equal ease. Our ancestors understood this duality intimately. They built their first settlements along riverbanks and coastlines, drawn to the abundance that water provided, yet always aware of its capacity for sudden violence. The great rivers of antiquity, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, were both nurturers and destroyers, predictable in their seasons yet capable of terrible surprises. Imagine, if you will, a time when the world was different. Not different in some vague, mythological sense, but actually, measurably different. We're speaking of a period that geologists call the last glacial maximum, which reached its peak roughly 26,000 years ago. Picture a planet locked in ice, with vast glaciers covering much of North America, Europe, and Asia. The ice sheets were miles thick in places, glittering monuments to cold that held captive an almost unimaginable volume of water. And because so much water was frozen, bound up in those continental glaciers, the oceans were lower, much lower, than they are today. How much lower? Between 300 and 400 feet below current sea levels. Let that settle into your mind for a moment. 300 to 400 feet. Entire landscapes that are now beneath the waves were once dry land, were once home to forests and grasslands, to rivers and lakes, to animals and, quite possibly, to people. The geography of the ancient world was profoundly different from what we know. The coastlines you could trace on a modern map would have been irrelevant then. Where today we see water, there was once earth. Where today we draw boundaries between continents and islands, there were once land bridges, highways of migration that allowed humans and animals to move freely across spaces now separated by sea. Consider the English Channel, that body of water separating Britain from continental Europe. During the last glacial maximum, it did not exist as we know it. Britain was not an island but a peninsula, connected to Europe by a broad, low-lying landmass that geologists have named Doggerland. This was no barren wasteland. Evidence suggests it was a rich, temperate plain, probably the heartland of northwestern European human settlement during that era. Rivers flowed through it, carrying meltwater from the northern ice. Forests grew. Animals grazed. And people, those resilient, adaptable, infinitely creative humans of the Paleolithic, made their lives there. Or think of Southeast Asia, where the story is even more dramatic. The shallow seas that now separate the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines from the Asian mainland were once dry land, a vast continental shelf called Sundaland. This region would have been immense, adding roughly 750,000 square miles to the available landmass of Asia. It would have been a diverse landscape, ranging from tropical rainforests to open savannas, from riverine corridors to coastal plains. The archaeological evidence from this region is frustratingly sparse, largely because anything that might have existed there now lies beneath 50 to 300 feet of seawater, but what little we have found suggests that Sundaland was home to thriving human populations. The same is true off the coasts of India, where the submerged regions of the continental shelf may have supported significant settlements. It's true in the Persian Gulf, which was a river valley during periods of lower sea level, a lush basin surrounded by hills that only later became an arm of the Indian Ocean. It's true off the eastern coast of North America, where the Atlantic shelf extended much farther out. It's true virtually everywhere you look, wherever the continental shelf sloped gently into the ocean, there were once lands that people could have inhabited. Now, what happened to all of this? The answer is both simple and cataclysmic. The ice melted. Starting around 19,000 years ago, the planet began to warm. The great ice sheets that had covered so much of the northern hemisphere began their long, irregular retreat. And as they melted, they released the water they had held frozen for millennia. That water had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. This was not a quick process, but neither was it uniformly slow and steady. The sea level rise happened in pulses, in fits and starts, sometimes gradual, sometimes shockingly rapid. Overall, between roughly 19,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago, the oceans rose by about 400 feet. Think about that. 400 feet of sea level rise over the course of 12,000 years. That averages out to about 4 inches per century, which doesn't sound like much, does it? 4 inches. Less than the length of your hand. Over the span of 100 years, such a rise might be barely noticeable to people living through it. But that's the average, and averages can be deceptive. The rise was not smooth. There were periods when the oceans rose much faster, dramatically faster, during events that scientists have given names like Meltwater Pulse 1A and Meltwater Pulse 1B. During Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred around 14,600 years ago, sea levels may have risen by as much as 50 feet in just a few centuries, perhaps even faster. Some estimates suggest rises of several feet per century during these pulse events, which would have been catastrophically obvious to anyone living along the coasts. Imagine being part of a coastal community during such a time. Your people have lived in the same place for generations, perhaps for hundreds of generations. You know the bay, the tidal pools, the fishing grounds, the landmarks as intimately as you know your own body. Then, over the course of your lifetime, you watch the sea claim territory. Not all at once, but relentlessly. The beach where you played as a child is now underwater. The freshwater spring that your grandparents used is now brackish, then saline, then submerged entirely. The low-lying areas where you gathered reeds and trapped waterfowl are now lagoons, then open water. Your community moves inland, then moves again, then again. The stories you were told about the land of your ancestors are now stories about places beneath the waves. This is not speculation. This is what happened to real people in real places. We know this from the geological record, from the cores taken from ocean sediments and lake beds, from the coral reefs that preserve ancient sea levels like pages in a book. We know it from the drowned river valleys, the submerged forests, the underwater caves that contain stalactites, which can only form in air, never underwater, now far below the surface. We know it from the traces of human habitation that underwater archaeologists have begun to find on the continental shelves. And we know it from the stories. Ah, the stories. This is where things become truly interesting, where the hard science of geology meets the soft mystery of mythology. Because flood stories, tales of great deluges that destroyed previous worlds, are not confined to one culture or one region. They are, in fact, one of the most widespread and persistent motifs in human mythology. They appear in Mesopotamia with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which includes a flood narrative that predates the biblical story of Noah. They appear in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, where God sends a flood to cleanse the earth of wickedness. They appear in ancient Greek mythology, where Zeus floods the world and only Deucalion and Pyrrha survive. They appear in Hindu texts, where Manu is warned of a coming deluge and saves himself, along with the seeds of all living things. But these are just the beginning. Flood myths appear in Chinese mythology, in the story of Gun Yu and the Great Flood that lasted for generations. They appear in Vietnamese folklore, in Australian Aboriginal traditions, in Native American legends from numerous tribes across both continents. The Maori of New Zealand tell of a great flood. The Mapuche of South America recount deluge stories. West African peoples, Polynesian islanders, Siberian tribes, all have their versions, their memories of a time when the waters rose and the old world ended. Now, one might argue that floods are simply common disasters, that any riverside culture will eventually experience catastrophic flooding, and therefore flood myths are inevitable and don't necessarily point to any single, global event. And there is truth to this. Floods are common. Rivers overflow. Storms bring inundations. Tsunamis strike coastlines. It would be strange if cultures didn't develop flood narratives. But consider the specific details that recur across these geographically separated traditions. Many describe not just a flood, but the flood, a world-ending deluge that marks a boundary between ages. Many specify that this flood was not merely a local overflow but a fundamental reshaping of the world. Many include the detail that the flood was preceded by a time of great human achievement or great human wickedness, depending on the moral framework of the culture telling the story. Many describe survivors who preserve knowledge or warn of the coming disaster. Many explain features of the current world, islands, mountains, certain geological formations, as remnants or consequences of that ancient catastrophe. The similarities are striking enough that scholars have long debated what they might mean. Are these stories simply reflecting universal human anxieties about water and disaster? Are they cultural memories, passed down across generations, of actual events experienced by ancestral populations? Could they possibly preserve some kernel of historical truth about the end of the Ice Age and the rising seas that must have displaced coastal populations worldwide? Let's consider what we know about human memory and oral tradition. For a long time, Western scholars were skeptical about the historical value of oral traditions, dismissing them as unreliable, corrupted by time, more myth than history. But that dismissal has been challenged repeatedly by archaeological discoveries that have confirmed the accuracy of oral traditions previously thought to be purely legendary. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions, for instance, speak of times when the sea level was lower, when you could walk to islands that are now separated from the mainland. These stories describe landscapes that, according to geological evidence, haven't existed for 7,000 to 10,000 years. Yet the stories persisted, passed down through countless generations. Similarly, Native American traditions from the Pacific Northwest preserve memories of massive landslides and tsunamis that geologists have been able to date and verify. Coastal tribes in British Columbia tell stories of the land shaking and the sea rising suddenly, stories that align with geological evidence of megathrust earthquakes and their resulting tsunamis. What this tells us is that human memory, when embedded in story and ritual and song, can be far more durable than we once imagined. Oral traditions are not perfect recordings, of course. They shift and change, they acquire moral lessons, they blend events from different times, they incorporate creative elements. But they can preserve a core of historical truth across time scales that would seem impossible if we thought only in terms of individual human lifespans. So when we encounter flood myths spread across the globe, describing world-changing deluges, we have to at least consider the possibility that these stories are remembering something real. Not a single, global flood that covered the entire Earth all at once, which the geological evidence does not support, but rather the cumulative impact of rising sea levels following the last glacial maximum, which different populations experienced at different times and in different ways, but which was, in its totality, a genuinely world-changing event. Now, let us take this one step further. Let us ask the question that brings us to the heart of tonight's meditation. If coastal populations were displaced by rising seas, if lands that had been inhabited for thousands of years were slowly, then rapidly, submerged, what was lost? What might have existed on those now drowned continental shelves? We know that humans tend to prefer coastal environments. We're drawn to water, to the resources it provides: fish, shellfish, waterfowl, reeds for building, access to trade and transportation. Archaeological evidence from the past 10,000 years consistently shows that some of the most densely populated and culturally sophisticated regions have been coastal. Why would the situation have been any different 12,000 years ago, or 15,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago? If anything, there's reason to think coastal areas would have been even more attractive during the Ice Age. The climate far inland, in the shadow of the great ice sheets, was harsh. Coastal regions, especially in tropical and temperate zones, would have offered more moderate climates, more diverse food sources, more opportunities for human communities to flourish. Standard archaeological narratives tell us that before the Neolithic Revolution, which began around 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans were hunter-gatherers living in small, mobile bands. We're told that complex societies, with settled communities, specialized labor, monumental architecture, and sophisticated cultural production, only arose after the development of agriculture. Before agriculture, the story goes, humans simply didn't have the population density, the food surplus, or the social organization necessary to create what we would recognize as civilization. But is this story complete? Or is it a story based on the evidence we happen to have, which is itself biased by the accidents of preservation? The archaeological record before the Neolithic is sparse, especially when we're looking for evidence of sophisticated societies. Why might that be? Well, consider what survives 10,000 years or more. Stone survives. Pottery survives, though it's fragmentary. Sometimes bone survives. Wood rarely survives unless conditions are exceptional, waterlogged or extremely dry or frozen. Textile almost never survives. Paper, parchment, anything organic, gone, or nearly so. This means that if a culture built primarily with wood, bamboo, reed, palm, or other plant materials, if they created art on bark or hide or woven fiber, if they recorded information in ways that didn't involve carving into stone or forming clay tablets, then almost no trace of them would remain for archaeologists to find. And if they lived along coastlines that are now underwater, then even their stone tools, their fire hearths, their heavier artifacts would be submerged, scattered by currents, buried under marine sediments, extraordinarily difficult to locate and study. Let me offer you a thought experiment. Imagine that some catastrophe erases modern civilization, and 10,000 years from now, archaeologists try to reconstruct what our world was like. But imagine that before the catastrophe, sea levels rose by 300 feet, drowning all of our coastal cities. New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai, Mumbai, Los Angeles, Sydney, all gone, all underwater. The archaeologists of the future dig inland, in the mountains and high plateaus, and they find scattered evidence of human presence. Some stone foundations, some pottery, but no cities, no libraries, no museums. Based on the inland evidence alone, they might conclude that we were a relatively simple people, living in small communities, not particularly advanced. They would miss the vast majority of our population, our cultural centers, our accumulated knowledge, because it's all beneath the ocean now. This is, essentially, the problem facing anyone who wants to investigate whether sophisticated Ice Age coastal societies might have existed. The evidence is underwater, and underwater archaeology is expensive, technically challenging, and still in its relative infancy. Most of the continental shelves remain unmapped in any detail. The few underwater sites that have been found and studied, like the remarkable underwater cave systems of the Yucatan Peninsula, which contain human remains and artifacts from the Paleo-Indian period, or the submerged settlements off the coast of Denmark and Sweden, or the worked stone structures found in water off various coastlines, these tantalizing discoveries hint at what might be out there, but we have barely scratched the surface. So let us allow ourselves to imagine, carefully and thoughtfully, what might have been. Not wild fantasy, but grounded speculation, informed by what we know about human capabilities and tendencies. Let us imagine a people living during the late Ice Age on a rich, temperate coastal plain, somewhere in what is now a submerged portion of a continental shelf. Perhaps they've lived there for hundreds of generations, long enough that they've developed an intimate knowledge of their environment. They know the seasonal movements of game animals. They know which plants are edible, which are medicinal, which can be used for dyes or fibers or building materials. They know the tides, the currents, the behavior of the sea. They have language, of course. Language is very old, far older than the Ice Age, though we can't know exactly how old. But by 40,000 years ago, humans were creating sophisticated cave art, engaging in long-distance trade, crafting elaborate tools, burying their dead with ceremony. All behaviors that require complex language. So our imagined people speak to each other, tell stories, share knowledge, pass on traditions. They have names for places, names for ancestors, names for the spirits or forces they believe animate the world around them. They create. They always create. Humans always create. They carve wood and bone, they weave fibers into baskets and nets and clothing, they create music with drums and flutes and their own voices. They dance. They paint their bodies, perhaps paint the walls of caves or rock shelters, or paint designs on wood and bark that have long since decayed. They develop distinctive styles, preferences, cultural markers that distinguish their community from others. They observe the sky. Hunter-gatherers throughout history have demonstrated sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They need it for navigation, for tracking seasons, for coordinating activities. There's no reason our imagined Ice Age people would be any different. They mark the solstices and equinoxes. They track the lunar cycle. They notice the planets, the bright wanderers among the fixed stars. They develop cosmologies, systems of meaning that help them understand their place in the vast pattern of things. They trade. Evidence of long-distance trade networks goes back tens of thousands of years. Shells from the ocean turn up hundreds of miles inland. Stone tools are found made from material quarried far from where the tools themselves are discovered. People have always traveled, always exchanged goods and ideas. So our coastal people trade with inland groups, perhaps offering dried fish and shellfish, salt, marine shells, materials from sea mammals, in exchange for flint, ochre, furs, hardwoods. These trading connections create relationships between communities, spread innovations, cross-pollinate cultures. And over time, over many, many generations, they might develop increasing levels of social complexity. Maybe the rich fishing grounds and abundant shellfish beds provide enough of a food surplus that not everyone needs to be directly involved in food procurement all the time. This allows for specialization. Some people become particularly skilled at making certain kinds of tools or creating certain kinds of art. Some people become ritual specialists, the ones who maintain the stories and ceremonies that bind the community together. Some people become particularly knowledgeable about navigation or about healing or about astronomy. The community might grow larger than the typical hunter-gatherer band of 20 to 50 people. Maybe it swells to 100, 200, 300 individuals, especially during certain seasons when resources are particularly abundant. And maybe, just maybe, they begin to create more permanent structures. Not monumental architecture necessarily, but substantial dwellings, community buildings, perhaps ritual centers. Built of wood and thatch and reed, which leave little trace, but no less sophisticated for their materials. They notice patterns in nature, develop proto-scientific knowledge. They understand that certain plants, when properly processed, can prevent or cure illness. They understand the connection between the movements of the moon and the tides. They develop techniques for preserving food, for treating hides, for starting fire in any weather. They understand that actions have consequences, that planning ahead leads to better outcomes than acting impulsively. They create containers to store food, oils, water. They develop methods of waterproofing, perhaps using resins or animal fats. They build boats, perhaps quite sophisticated ones, allowing them to fish farther from shore, to trade with distant communities, to explore. And they tell stories. Always, they tell stories. Stories about how the world came to be. Stories about the ancestors and their deeds. Stories about why things are the way they are. Stories that teach moral lessons. Stories that preserve practical knowledge about the environment. Stories that bind the community together in a shared understanding of who they are and where they came from. Now, into this imagined world, into this established pattern of life that has persisted for hundreds of generations, something changes. At first, perhaps it's barely noticeable. The elders might remark that the sea seems slightly higher than it used to be, that certain landmarks are disappearing. But the change is so gradual, happening over multiple human lifetimes, that each generation adjusts, moves back a little from the shore, adapts. But then, perhaps, there comes a period when the change accelerates. This could be during one of those meltwater pulse events, when sea levels rise several feet in a century or less. Now the change is unmistakable. The bay is swallowing the lowlands. The freshwater marshes are becoming brackish. The river mouths are migrating inland. Storms drive the saltwater farther and farther up the river valleys. The fish species are changing. The shellfish beds are relocating or disappearing. The game migration routes are disrupted as the landscape transforms. The community is forced to move. But where? The good coastal lands are becoming increasingly scarce, and other communities are having the same problem, leading to competition for dwindling territory. Maybe conflicts arise. Maybe alliances form. Maybe some groups decide to move inland, abandoning the coast entirely, leaving behind the lands their ancestors knew and adapting to new environments. Maybe some groups try to stay as close to the changing coast as possible, moving repeatedly, never settling long enough to develop the kind of permanence they once had. Knowledge begins to fragment. Some of it is preserved in story, especially the most important elements. The warnings about water, the memory of the lost lands, the instruction to pay attention to signs of rising sea. But the specific details, the intricate knowledge built up over hundreds of generations about this particular coastline, this particular ecosystem, becomes less and less relevant as the coastline itself ceases to exist. Generations pass. The sea continues to rise. The old lands are now fully submerged, existing only in memory, in stories about the before times, about the land that was swallowed, about the homeland beneath the waves. The descendants of our imagined coastal people are now living in new places, adapted to new conditions, intermingled with other groups. The stories persist, but they become more mythologized, more symbolic, less clearly connected to specific events and places. And eventually, thousands of years later, these stories are some of the many flood myths scattered across human cultures. They no longer contain enough specific detail to reconstruct what actually happened. They've been transformed by time, by retelling, by the overlay of later cultural and religious frameworks. But at their core, they carry the memory of a real trauma, a real transformation, a real loss. This is speculation, yes. But it is informed speculation, grounded in what we know about geology, about sea level changes, about human capabilities during the Paleolithic, about the persistence of oral tradition, about the distribution of flood myths. It is a bridge between the hard data of science and the soft wisdom of story, between what we can prove and what we can intuit. Now, some versions of this idea go much further than what I've described. They suggest not just relatively sophisticated coastal communities, but full-fledged civilizations comparable to or even exceeding what we know from recorded history. They propose that these ancient peoples had advanced architecture, developed writing systems, possessed sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge, perhaps even technologies that seem anachronistic for the time period. They point to certain archaeological anomalies, to underwater structures that some argue are artificial, to alignments and patterns in ancient sites that might indicate lost knowledge. The most famous proponent of this view is probably Graham Hancock, who has written extensively about the possibility of an advanced Ice Age civilization that was largely destroyed by floods at the end of the last glacial period. Hancock draws connections between flood myths from different cultures, highlights the sophistication of certain megalithic sites that seem to predate the development of agriculture, and argues that there are hints of a lost legacy of knowledge that influenced the later development of civilizations we do recognize. Mainstream archaeology is deeply skeptical of these claims, and for good reasons. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for a highly advanced, globe-spanning Ice Age civilization simply isn't there in a form that can withstand rigorous scrutiny. The underwater structures that some cite as evidence generally have more prosaic explanations. They are natural formations, or they are much more recent than claimed, or they are indeed artificial but from later periods that we already know about. The astronomical alignments and mathematical patterns can often be explained by chance, by the fact that humans naturally notice patterns, or by the genuine but more limited astronomical knowledge that we know ancient peoples possessed without needing to invoke a lost advanced civilization. Moreover, an advanced civilization would be expected to leave behind more than just tantalizing hints. There should be clear evidence in the archaeological and geological record. Distinctive tool assemblages, evidence of metallurgy if they had developed it, remains of large-scale construction even if built with perishable materials, evidence of agriculture or animal domestication if they had developed those technologies, signs of widespread trade networks carrying distinctive artifacts. The absence of such evidence is telling. But skepticism toward the most dramatic claims doesn't require us to dismiss the entire question. The truth, as is often the case, may lie somewhere in between the extremes. Between the conventional narrative that treats all pre-agricultural humans as living in simple, small-scale societies, and the speculative narrative that posits a lost supercivilization, there is space for a more nuanced understanding. We can acknowledge that human capabilities and creativity go back much farther than we sometimes give credit for. We can recognize that the archaeological record is incomplete, especially for coastal areas now underwater and for any cultures that built primarily with organic materials. We can take seriously the possibility that the end of the Ice Age, with its dramatic environmental changes, disrupted human societies in ways that caused significant loss of accumulated knowledge and cultural continuity. we can consider that flood myths may preserve genuine cultural memories of these traumatic transformations. At the same time, we can maintain scientific rigor, requiring solid evidence before accepting specific claims, being careful not to see patterns where none exist, avoiding the temptation to fill gaps in our knowledge with speculation dressed up as fact. This balanced approach is less dramatic, perhaps, than either extreme. It doesn't give us a simple, satisfying answer. It leaves us with uncertainty, with possibility, with questions that may never be fully resolved. But there is a kind of peace in that uncertainty, a gentle acknowledgement that the world is more complex and mysterious than any single narrative can capture. Let us drift now into a more meditative space, into the realm where history and imagination meet. Let us think about water itself, about what it means, about why the image of the flood resonates so deeply in human consciousness. Water is transformation. Water is the great dissolver, the substance that breaks down boundaries, that returns the solid to the fluid, that erases what was and makes space for what will be. In many creation myths, the world begins with water, with a formless ocean or a primordial flood from which land and life eventually emerge. Water is potential, the state before definition. And in flood myths, water is the force that returns the world to that undefined state, washing away what had become corrupt or exhausted or simply finished, clearing the space for a new beginning. There is a psychological dimension to this symbolism that feels almost archetypal, in the Jungian sense. The unconscious mind is often symbolized by water in dreams, deep, mysterious, containing both treasures and dangers, the source from which conscious thoughts and images arise. A flood in this symbolic framework represents the overwhelming of consciousness by unconscious material, a destruction of the ego's structures and certainties, a kind of death that is also the precondition for rebirth and transformation. Perhaps this is part of why flood stories feel so powerful, so resonant across cultures. They speak not just to possible historical events but to universal human experiences of loss and change, of the way that everything we build, every certainty we establish, is ultimately temporary, subject to forces larger than ourselves. They remind us of our vulnerability, but also of our resilience, our capacity to survive catastrophe and begin again. In the story of Noah's Ark, which is probably the flood narrative most familiar to those raised in Western culture, the flood is explicitly a moral judgment, a cleansing of a world that has become wicked. But it is also a story about preservation and continuity. Noah is instructed to take 2 of every kind of animal, to preserve life itself through the catastrophe. He is a keeper of knowledge, a link between the world that was and the world that will be. This motif appears in other flood traditions as well. In the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is warned of the coming flood by the god Ea and builds an ark, saving not just his family but also craftsmen and animals. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, and preserves the seeds of all plants and animals. In many Native American traditions, there are culture heroes who survived the flood and go on to teach the people essential knowledge. What are these stories remembering, or what are they expressing? Perhaps they express a fundamental human understanding that knowledge is fragile, that it must be actively preserved and transmitted or it will be lost. Perhaps they remember times when the loss of knowledge was a real and pressing danger, when environmental catastrophes forced populations to abandon accumulated wisdom and start over with only what they could carry in memory. Imagine being part of a community forced to flee rising seas, forced to abandon established settlements and move inland into unfamiliar territory. What knowledge would you fight hardest to preserve? Probably the most immediately practical: how to find food, how to make tools, how to create shelter. But you would also try to preserve the stories, the sense of who you are as a people, where you came from, what you've learned. Some of that knowledge would survive. Some of it would inevitably be lost, especially the more specialized knowledge, the things that only a few people knew, or the knowledge that was specific to the coastal environment you're leaving behind. Over generations, Over many such forced migrations, much could be lost. And yet something essential could survive. The memory that there was a before, that the world has not always been as it is now, that water has the power to transform everything, that paying attention to environmental changes can mean the difference between survival and extinction. Let us think now about some of the specific places in the world where land has been lost to rising seas, and consider what might have been there. We mentioned Doggerland earlier, that region connecting Britain to Europe. Recent seafloor mapping and study of materials dredged up from the North Sea have given us an increasingly detailed picture of what Doggerland was like. It appears to have been a landscape of rivers and hills, marshes and forests, rich in game and other resources. Artifacts recovered from Doggerland include worked flint tools, barbed antler points used for hunting or fishing, and fragments of wood that may have been worked by human hands. The flooding of Doggerland was not instantaneous, but it was inexorable. Around 8,200 years ago, a submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, generated a massive tsunami that struck the Doggerland coast. By that time, Doggerland was already reduced to a low-lying archipelago, the highlands having been submerged as sea levels rose. The tsunami would have been devastating to any community still living there. Within another 1,000 years, Doggerland was completely submerged. The people who had lived in Doggerland didn't vanish, they moved, they adapted, they merged with populations in Britain and on the European continent. But their homeland disappeared beneath the waves, and with it, any permanent structures they had built, any artwork they had created that wasn't portable, any places that held special significance in their culture. What remains are scattered artifacts, fragmentary evidence of lives lived on a land that no longer exists. Or consider Sundaland, that vast region of Southeast Asia. At its maximum extent during the last glacial maximum, Sundaland would have connected the Malay Peninsula with Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, creating a landmass roughly the size of India. The climate would have been tropical, the forests dense, the river systems extensive. This would have been prime territory for human habitation. There are hints that Sundaland may have been a crucial region in early human migration and development. Some geneticists and archaeologists have suggested that it could have been a refugium during the Ice Age, a place where populations were relatively dense and stable, which would have facilitated cultural development. The archaeological evidence is maddeningly scarce because so much of the area is now underwater, but what little has been found. In caves in Borneo, on islands that were once hilltops in the Sunda Plain, in scattered coastal sites, suggest sophisticated stone tool industries, evidence of boats and long-distance voyaging, possibly some of the earliest pottery in the world. As sea levels rose, Sundaland fragmented, creating the island geography we know today. This would have been a long, complex process spanning thousands of years. Communities would have been repeatedly displaced, forced to adapt to shrinking territories and changing coastlines. Trade routes that once crossed dry land would have had to be maintained across growing expanses of water, requiring ever more sophisticated maritime technology. Some populations would have become isolated on islands, leading to cultural divergence. Knowledge that had been shared across the region might have fragmented into distinct traditions. The flooding of Sundaland may have had profound consequences for human population dynamics in Asia and beyond. Some researchers have suggested that waves of migration out of Sundaland, as populations were displaced by rising seas, could have influenced the cultural and genetic makeup of populations throughout Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and possibly beyond. The sophisticated maritime traditions of Austronesian peoples, who eventually colonized islands across the Pacific, might have roots that go back to adaptations developed during and after the flooding of Sundaland. In the Persian Gulf, there's evidence that what is now a shallow sea was, during periods of low sea level, a river valley. Recent bathymetric surveys and sediment studies have revealed what appears to be an ancient river channel running the length of the Gulf, carved by what would have been a major river system draining the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers of the region. The valley would have been habitable, possibly quite fertile, before it was flooded as sea levels rose. Some archaeologists and historians have speculated, cautiously, about whether memories of this flooding might be connected to the flood narratives that are so prominent in Mesopotamian mythology. The Epic of Gilgamesh, after all, is from this region, and its flood story is remarkably detailed, so detailed that it was clearly based on something, even if that something was the regular devastating floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers rather than the one-time inundation of the Gulf Valley. But it's at least interesting to consider that the cultural memory of the region might hold layers of meaning, reflecting multiple experiences of flood across different time scales. The Black Sea presents another fascinating case, one that has been the subject of considerable scientific investigation and debate. Today, the Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean Sea through the Bosphorus Strait, a narrow channel that runs through what is now Istanbul. But this connection was not always open. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower, the Black Sea was actually a landlocked freshwater lake, cut off from the Mediterranean by the land bridge that formed where the Bosphorus is today. As global sea levels rose following the end of the Ice Age, the Mediterranean crept higher and higher. Around 7,600 years ago, according to one prominent hypothesis, the rising Mediterranean finally breached the Bosphorus land bridge. What happened next would have been catastrophic. The Mediterranean, sitting at a much higher level than the Black Sea Lake, would have poured through the breach in an immense waterfall, possibly the largest waterfall the world has ever known. The calculations are staggering. Water flowing through at a rate perhaps 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, raising the level of the Black Sea by inches per day, flooding coastal lowlands at a pace that would have been terrifyingly obvious to anyone living there. This hypothesis, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, has been debated vigorously in the scientific community. Some evidence supports it. Sediment cores showing a sudden transition from freshwater to saltwater species, submerged ancient shorelines, what appear to be preserved river channels on the Black Sea floor. Other evidence complicates the picture, suggesting the flooding might have been more gradual or might have occurred at a different time. The debate continues, which is how science should work, but the basic facts are not in dispute. The Black Sea did change from a freshwater lake to a saltwater sea, and this transition did involve flooding of the coastal lowlands. If the catastrophic flood hypothesis is correct, it would have had devastating consequences for any human communities living around the shores of the Black Sea Lake. They would have had little warning, perhaps only days or weeks to flee as the waters rose. Everything they had built, everything they couldn't carry, would have been abandoned to the advancing sea. And this event, occurring in a region that was already inhabited by farming communities, were now in the Neolithic period, would have produced refugees, displaced populations radiating outward, carrying with them stories of the disaster. Some researchers have suggested that this event might be connected to flood narratives that appear in the mythology of the region, perhaps even to the biblical flood story, though that's highly speculative. What is less speculative is that such an event would have been seared into the collective memory of any cultures that experienced it, transmitted through generations as a foundational story about the power of water and the fragility of human settlements. Let us pause here and breathe, let the images settle. Water advancing, relentless and impersonal. Communities uprooted. Knowledge scattered. But also, survival. Adaptation. The continuity of human culture even through catastrophe. This is what we are, what we have always been. We are the ones who remember, who carry forward, who build again after the waters recede. Moving to the Americas, we find a similar pattern of drowned coastlines and potentially lost settlements. The Pacific coast of North America, particularly from British Columbia down through California, has a relatively narrow continental shelf, which means the sea level rise would have had less dramatic effects in terms of total land area lost. but the coastlines that did exist during the Ice Age would have been prime territory for human habitation, and they're now underwater. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, proposed by anthropologist John Erlandson and others, suggests that early migrants to the Americas might have traveled down the Pacific coast, following the rich marine resources provided by kelp forests. Kelp forests support abundant fish, shellfish, marine mammals, and seabirds. Essentially everything a coastal population needs to thrive. If this hypothesis is correct, and there's growing evidence to support it, then there could have been thriving communities all along this coast during the late Ice Age and the early post-glacial period. And the evidence for these communities would now be underwater. Recent underwater archaeological surveys have begun to find evidence supporting this idea. Off the coast of California's Channel Islands, divers have discovered stone tools and other artifacts in what is now 50 feet of water, indicating human presence on coastlines that are now submerged. The Channel Islands themselves were once part of a much larger landmass called Santarosi, which has since been broken up by rising seas. Similar discoveries have been made in other locations along the coast, though the work is painstaking and has only scratched the surface of what might be out there. On the Atlantic coast, the continental shelf extends much farther from the present shoreline. During the Ice Age, this would have been extensive dry land, potentially very attractive to human populations. The Gulf of Mexico coast similarly had much more land exposed. Any communities that existed on these now submerged coastal plains would have left their archaeological traces underwater, where they are extremely difficult to locate and study. Indigenous traditions from various parts of North America include references to lands lost to the sea, to islands that disappeared, to coastlines that changed. The Chumash people of what is now California speak of ancestral lands that are now beneath the ocean. Various Pacific Northwest tribes have traditions about changes in sea level and coastline. These stories are often dismissed as simply mythological, but in light of what we know about the reality of sea level rise and the potential for oral traditions to preserve historical memories, perhaps they deserve more careful consideration. The same patterns appear globally. In the Pacific, there are traditions among various island cultures about former lands, about islands that sank or were broken apart. While some of these stories might refer to more localized events, volcanic activity, earthquakes, tsunamis, others might preserve memories from the period of post-glacial sea level rise, when the coastlines of existing landmasses were being reshaped and when some low-lying areas were indeed being submerged. In the Indian Ocean region, both the eastern and western coasts of India would have had extensive land areas that are now underwater. The Gulf of Khambhat, off the western coast of India, has been the site of controversial claims about underwater structures that some argue are the remains of an ancient, pre-flood civilization. The scientific consensus is that these structures are most likely natural geological formations, but the very fact that people are looking, that underwater surveys are being conducted, reflects a growing acknowledgement that the submerged continental shelves are archaeologically significant areas that deserve systematic investigation. Around the Arabian Peninsula, the coastal areas would have been quite different during periods of lower sea level. The Red Sea was narrower, the Persian Gulf was largely dry land as we mentioned earlier, and the southern coast of Arabia, facing the Indian Ocean, had more land exposed. This region was potentially a crucial corridor for human migration out of Africa, and any evidence of early human presence along the ancient coastlines is now beneath the water. In the Mediterranean, there are numerous locations where coastal settlements from various periods are now underwater, though most of these are from more recent times, ancient Greek, Roman, or later settlements that have been submerged by more modest sea level changes or by local tectonic subsidence. But there are also earlier sites, harder to date and identify, that hint at human presence on coastlines that were later drowned. What emerges from this global survey is a picture of a world that was fundamentally different from the one we know, and a recognition that vast areas that were once land, that could have supported human populations, are now beyond our easy reach beneath the sea. The archaeological record we have is biased toward inland sites, toward places that remained above water. We are, in a very real sense, seeing only part of the picture, and the missing part might be significant. Now, let us consider the mechanics of memory, of how information survives across vast spans of time without writing. Oral tradition is often thought of as unreliable, a kind of telephone game where the message becomes garbled with each transmission. And certainly, oral traditions do change over time. Details are added or lost, events from different periods become conflated, moral or religious frameworks are overlaid onto historical events, creative elaboration occurs. But oral traditions are not simply casual retellings. In societies that depend on oral transmission, there are often specific mechanisms designed to preserve information accurately. Stories are told in formalized ways, often in verse or with rhythmic patterns that aid memorization. They are repeated regularly, at ceremonies or gatherings, reinforcing the memory. There are often designated people whose role is to remember and transmit the stories: elders, bards, priests, historians. In some cultures, there are checks on accuracy, where multiple people know the stories and can correct errors in retelling. The stories are embedded in ritual, in place, in practice, making them multisensory experiences rather than just verbal recitations. Australian Aboriginal cultures have some of the most extensive and demonstrably accurate oral traditions in the world, preserving information across time scales that once seemed impossible. Stories about ancestral beings and landscapes have been passed down for tens of thousands of years. And increasingly, scientists are finding that these stories preserve accurate information about geological and climatic events from the deep past. Stories about the flooding of coastlines, about walking to islands now separated by water, about volcanic eruptions, about the arrival or extinction of certain animals, these stories are being validated by archaeological and geological evidence. The key insight is that oral tradition is not just about remembering facts in isolation. It's about remembering in context, embedding information in narrative and landscape and social practice. A story about a flood is not just a story, it's connected to specific places that still exist, to practices around water and safety, to ceremonial obligations, to kinship structures. All of these connections reinforce the memory and create multiple pathways for transmission. So when we encounter flood myths distributed across different cultures, we should consider the possibility that they are not simply invented stories or metaphors, but that they preserve real memories, however transformed, of real events that mattered profoundly to the ancestors of those cultures. The flood, the loss of land, the displacement of populations, the breaking apart of communities. These were genuinely world-changing events from the perspective of the people who experienced them, and it makes sense that the memory would persist. But memory is not the same as accurate historical record. Memory is selective, it emphasizes certain elements and downplays others, it shapes itself to fit the needs and understanding of the present. A memory of coastal flooding might become, over generations, a story about divine judgment, or about the separation of the living world from an underworld, or about the origin of certain landscape features. The core event might be preserved, the water rose, the land was lost, but the framework around it, the explanation for why it happened and what it meant, that framework is culturally constructed. This is why we have to be careful about reading too much into flood myths. They tell us something, but not everything. They suggest that coastal flooding was significant enough to be remembered, but they don't tell us in precise terms what existed on the drowned lands. They tell us that the people who experienced these changes found them traumatic and meaningful, but they don't give us a detailed inventory of what was lost. Let us drift now into the realm of what could have been lost, if indeed there were sophisticated coastal cultures during the Ice Age. Knowledge systems would be the most significant loss, more significant even than physical structures or artifacts. Knowledge takes generations to accumulate and can be lost in a single generation if not transmitted. Imagine, for instance, astronomical knowledge. Many ancient cultures developed sophisticated understanding of celestial patterns. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble in Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over thousands of years. They created calendars, predicted eclipses, aligned structures to celestial events. This knowledge had both practical applications, determining when to plant or harvest, when to expect seasonal changes, and ritual significance. If Ice Age coastal peoples had developed such knowledge, it would have been embedded in their culture, used to coordinate activities, enshrined in myth and ceremony. But if those cultures were disrupted, if the people were displaced and forced to adapt to new environments, how much of that specialized knowledge would survive? Perhaps the basic observations would persist, the cycle of seasons, the phases of the moon. But the more sophisticated understandings, the careful records of long-term patterns, those might be lost. Or consider botanical and pharmacological knowledge. Hunter-gatherers throughout history have possessed encyclopedic knowledge of plants, which are edible, which are poisonous, which have medicinal properties, how to process them to remove toxins or enhance benefits, when and where to find them. This knowledge is specific to particular ecosystems. If you're forced to leave a coastal environment and move inland, much of your plant knowledge becomes less relevant. You'll have to learn new plants, new patterns. Some of the old knowledge might be adapted, but some will simply become obsolete and be forgotten. Maritime knowledge would be another significant category. If you're a coastal people, you develop deep understanding of the sea. Currents, tides, weather patterns, the behavior of fish and marine mammals, navigation techniques, boat-building technologies. This is sophisticated, practical knowledge built up over countless generations. But if rising seas force you inland, away from the coast, that maritime knowledge becomes less immediately relevant. It might be preserved in story for a while, but without practical application, it would gradually fade. Agricultural knowledge, if it had been developed, would face similar challenges. Agriculture requires specific knowledge about specific plants in specific conditions. If you're displaced from your traditional lands, you might not be able to grow the same crops in your new location. You might have to start over, domesticating new species or adapting to what's already growing where you've moved. The old knowledge doesn't transfer directly. Social and organizational knowledge could be disrupted as well. Complex societies require sophisticated social organization, mechanisms for resolving disputes, distributing resources, coordinating group activities, maintaining social cohesion. If a society is broken apart by environmental catastrophe, if large groups are fragmented into smaller refugee populations, those organizational structures might collapse. The knowledge of how to maintain them might persist in memory, but without the practical application, it becomes theoretical rather than functional. And artistic traditions, spiritual practices, ceremonial knowledge, all of these are vulnerable when communities are disrupted. Ceremonies often depend on specific locations, sacred sites, ritual landscapes, places imbued with ancestral significance. If those places are lost beneath the waves, the ceremonies associated with them might be adapted, moved to new locations, but something is inevitably lost in the translation. Art forms that depend on specific materials might not survive if those materials are no longer available. Stories tied to specific landscapes become abstract when those landscapes no longer exist. Now, it's important to emphasize again that all of this is speculative. We don't know that sophisticated Ice Age coastal cultures existed. We don't know what knowledge systems they might have developed. We're imagining possibilities based on what we know about human capabilities and on the fragmentary hints from archaeology and oral tradition. But the speculation is not baseless. It's grounded in real patterns, real evidence, real questions that deserve to be asked. What we do know, without speculation, is that sea levels rose dramatically following the last glacial maximum. We know that this would have affected coastal populations. We know that humans were living in coastal areas during this period. We know that flood myths are widespread across cultures. We know that oral traditions can preserve historical memories across impressive time spans. These are the facts. The question is how we interpret them, what picture we construct from these pieces of evidence. The mainstream archaeological view tends to be conservative, and with good reason. Archaeology is a science, and science requires evidence that can be tested and verified. Claims about advanced Ice Age civilizations have been made before, often without adequate evidence, sometimes motivated more by ideology than by careful investigation. So there's a healthy skepticism, a resistance to accepting dramatic claims without dramatic proof. But conservatism can also become dogmatism if we're not careful. If we assume that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, if we conclude that because we haven't found something it must not exist, we might miss important possibilities. The underwater realm of the continental shelves is, in many ways, terra incognita, unmapped and unexplored. We're only beginning to develop the technology and the will to investigate these regions systematically. It would be premature to declare with certainty what did or didn't exist there. The wise path, perhaps, is to remain open to possibilities while maintaining rigorous standards for evidence. To acknowledge that our picture of the human past is incomplete, that the archaeological record has biases and gaps, that surprises are still possible. To take seriously the questions raised by the flood myths and by the reality of sea level rise, while not leaping to unsupported conclusions. To continue investigating, mapping the seafloor, conducting underwater archaeology, studying oral traditions, looking for the pieces of the puzzle we haven't yet found. And in the meantime, to sit with the mystery, to allow it to remain mysterious. There is something deeply human about wanting to know, wanting to solve the puzzle, wanting to have a complete and certain picture of the past. But there is also something valuable about uncertainty, about the recognition that some questions remain open, that some mysteries are not yet solved, perhaps never will be fully solved. That uncertainty can be a space of wonder rather than frustration, an invitation to imagination tempered by wisdom. Let us think about the nature of loss itself, about what it means for something to be irretrievably gone. In our modern world, we're accustomed to thinking that information, once recorded, is permanent. We have books, photographs, recordings, digital archives. We have multiple copies, backups, distributed storage. The idea that knowledge could simply vanish seems almost impossible. But for most of human history, this was not the case. Knowledge existed in minds, in practices, in oral traditions, in objects that were themselves fragile and temporary. When a culture disappeared, or was transformed, or was absorbed into another culture, knowledge could be lost. Not all of it, not necessarily even most of it, but enough to matter. Enough that the people who came after might look at the remnants and not understand what they were seeing, might not even know that something had been lost. There are examples throughout history of knowledge that was lost and had to be rediscovered or that remains lost to this day. The ancient Greeks developed sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics. Much of this knowledge was preserved through Arabic scholars during the European Middle Ages, but some of it was lost. The precise techniques used to create certain ancient materials, Damascus steel, Roman concrete, Greek fire, these were lost when the cultures that knew them declined. The knowledge existed, people had it, used it, depended on it, and then it was gone. In the Americas, the Spanish conquest led to the destruction of vast amounts of indigenous knowledge. Books were burned, knowledge keepers were killed, oral traditions were disrupted, practices were suppressed. Some knowledge survived, transmitted in secret or in adapted forms, but much was lost irrevocably. We know it existed because the conquistadors documented some of what they saw before they destroyed it, but we can't reconstruct it fully from those fragmentary Spanish accounts. More recently, anthropologists have documented the loss of traditional knowledge in indigenous communities around the world as younger generations assimilate into broader national and global cultures, as languages die out, as elders pass away without having fully transmitted their knowledge. This is happening now, in our time, and despite all our technology for recording and preserving information, we are still losing knowledge, because knowledge is not just information. It's practice, it's context, it's embedded in ways of life. If we lost knowledge in recorded history, with writing and institutions and conscious efforts at preservation, how much more vulnerable would knowledge have been in pre-literate societies experiencing massive environmental disruptions? The answer is, very vulnerable indeed. This doesn't prove that sophisticated knowledge systems existed in the Ice Age, we're still speculating there. But it does mean that if they existed, it's entirely plausible that they could have been largely lost, leaving only fragments, hints, half-remembered stories. There is a melancholy to this contemplation, a sadness about impermanence and loss. But there is also something strangely comforting about it, a reminder that we are part of long cycles of building and losing, remembering and forgetting, creating and letting go. Our own civilizations, with all their accumulated knowledge and achievement, are not permanent either. They too will eventually pass, will eventually be incomprehensible to future people, will eventually become myths and mysteries. This is not a pessimistic thought, not really. It's a realistic thought, a grounding thought. It puts our own time in perspective, reminds us that we are one moment in a very long story, that the people who came before us were as real and as complex as we are, and the people who come after us will be too. Our time is not the pinnacle of history, the culmination toward which everything was building. It's one turn of a wheel that has been turning for a very long time and will continue to turn long after we're gone. And yet, despite the impermanence, despite the losses, something persists. Human culture continues. We still tell stories, still create beauty, still seek to understand ourselves and the world around us, still build communities and relationships, still laugh and mourn and dream. The specific forms change, but the underlying human spirit remains recognizable across vast gulfs of time and culture. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, written down nearly 4,000 years ago but based on stories that are even older, we recognize the emotions, the fears, the longings. When we look at cave paintings created 30,000 years ago, we see the same impulse to represent, to communicate, to leave a mark. When we hear flood stories from cultures around the world, we hear people grappling with the same existential questions we still grapple with: why do terrible things happen? How do we survive catastrophe? What endures when everything else is swept away? The answer, always, is, we endure. Not as individuals. Individuals are fragile, temporary, like everything else. But as a species, as a continuing project, as a conversation that spans generations. We endure in the stories we tell, in the knowledge we pass on, in the children we raise, in the things we make and the love we give and the small acts of kindness and courage that ripple forward through time. If there were people living on the drowned lands, if they watched the waters rise and had to flee, had to leave behind everything they couldn't carry, they endured too. Their specific cultures might have been transformed beyond recognition. Their knowledge might have been lost or scattered or blended into new forms. But their children survived, their descendants lived on, their DNA is still with us, their basic humanity is still with us. They are part of the long conversation, part of the story, even if we can't reconstruct exactly who they were or what they knew. Let us think about water again, about its symbolic and literal roles in human life. Water is life, quite literally. Our bodies are mostly water. We can survive only a few days without it. Civilizations have always organized themselves around water sources, rivers, springs, wells, coastlines. Water is also danger. Too much water, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, is flood, is destruction. Not enough water is drought, is death of another kind. We have always had an ambivalent relationship with water. We need it desperately, yet we fear it. We are drawn to it, find it beautiful, calming, but we also know its power to destroy. This ambivalence shows up in our myths and symbols. Water is both womb and tomb, both the source of life and the bringer of endings. In flood myths, water is almost always an agent of transformation, of destruction that clears the way for renewal. The old world, corrupt or exhausted, is washed away. The survivors emerge into a new world, clean and full of possibility. It's a reset, a chance to begin again, to do better. This narrative structure suggests a deep understanding of change, of the way that sometimes things have to end before something new can begin, that loss and renewal are intertwined. But the flood myths also carry a warning. They tell us to pay attention, to heed signs, to prepare for disasters even when the skies seem clear. They tell us that complacency is dangerous, that assuming things will always continue as they are is a mistake. They remind us that we live in a dynamic world, subject to forces beyond our control, and that wisdom lies in respecting those forces rather than ignoring them. In our own time, we face the prospect of rising seas again, though for different reasons than our ancestors did. Anthropogenic climate change is causing glaciers and ice sheets to melt, is warming and therefore expanding the oceans, is raising sea levels at a pace that, while slow by human standards, is quite rapid by geological standards. Coastal cities, home to billions of people, are vulnerable. We have the scientific knowledge to predict what's coming, the technological capacity to respond, but also the political and social challenges of coordinating action on a global scale. In a way, we are in a position to create our own flood myth, or to avoid creating one. How we respond to the challenge of climate change, how we adapt to changing conditions, whether we manage to maintain social cohesion and preserve knowledge through the transition, these will determine what stories future generations tell about us. Will we be remembered as wise ancestors who foresaw the danger and prepared? Or as careless predecessors who ignored the warnings and left their descendants to cope with catastrophe? These questions bring us full circle, back to the question we started with. What if an earlier advanced civilization was erased by a great flood? Whether or not such a civilization existed, the question itself is valuable because it makes us think about fragility and resilience, about the long arc of human history, about what matters and what endures. It reminds us that we are not separate from nature but part of it, subject to the same forces that have shaped human destiny throughout our history. The earth is patient. Water is patient. The cycles of ice and warmth, of sea level rise and fall, these play out over time scales that dwarf human lifespans, yet they profoundly affect human experience. Our civilizations feel permanent to us because they persist longer than we do as individuals. But from the perspective of geological time, they are brief indeed, flickers of light in a long night. Yet those flickers matter. Each human life matters. Each culture, each moment of beauty or insight or kindness, each story told and song sung, each thing learned and made, these have intrinsic value, regardless of whether they persist forever. The meaning is in the living, not in the permanence. Perhaps that's the deepest lesson of the flood myths, deeper than any specific historical claim. They tell us that nothing lasts forever, that even worlds end, but that life goes on, that the human capacity for creativity and resilience is not dependent on permanence. Imagine standing on a beach at twilight, watching the waves come in, steady and inevitable. Each wave is unique, forms and crests and breaks and dissipates, and then another comes behind it, and another, endless, unchanging in their rhythm even though no two waves are identical. Human cultures are like that perhaps. Each one forms, crests, breaks, fades back into the greater pattern. But the ocean continues, the capacity for waves continues, and there is beauty in each one, even though none last. The lands beneath the sea were once home to people like us, people who loved and feared and hoped and dreamed. They felt the sun on their skin and the wind in their hair. They tasted food and heard music and told stories around fires. They watched their children grow. They laughed at jokes we would recognize. They wondered about the stars. They were fully human as we are, though separated from us by thousands of years and by fathoms of water and by our inability to know them except through fragments and guesses and the stories that might, just might, remember them. If those people could speak to us, what would they say? Perhaps something simple. Perhaps just, remember that nothing is permanent. Pay attention to your world. Adapt when you must. Preserve what you can. Tell your stories. Take care of each other. Find meaning in the moment, not in the illusion of permanence. These are old lessons, ancient lessons, lessons that every generation has to learn anew because they can't be inherited, only discovered through living. The flood myths teach them. The drowned lands teach them. The patient water teaches them. And here we are, still learning, still trying to understand, still building and losing and building again. Let your breathing slow now, let your thoughts drift like kelp in a gentle current. There is no urgency here, no crisis demanding immediate action. We are simply sitting with a question, with a mystery, with the space between what we know and what we imagine. This space is comfortable, peaceful even. We don't need to solve everything tonight. We don't need to reach a definitive conclusion. We can simply rest in the not knowing, in the possibility, in the gentle acknowledgement that the past is larger and stranger than any single narrative can capture. The night is deep. The stars above, if you can see them, are the same stars that ancient peoples saw, though they have wheeled slightly in their positions across the millennia. The water, if you're near water, is part of the same great cycle that has been flowing since the earth was young, the same water that once covered Doggerland and Sundaland and all the other lost lands, the same water that sustains us now, the same water that will outlast us and our civilizations and all our works. There is peace in that thought, strange as it might seem. Peace in recognizing our place in the vast pattern, our temporary but real significance, our connection to all the humans who came before and all who will come after. We are brief, but we are part of something ongoing. We are individual waves in an ocean that predates us and will continue after us, and that's exactly as it should be. The question we began with, what if a great flood erased an earlier advanced civilization, might never be answered definitively. The evidence is underwater, scattered, fragmentary, difficult to interpret. But in pondering the question, we've traveled together through time and across the world. We've thought about water and memory, loss and continuity, knowledge and its fragility, the long arc of human experience. We've allowed ourselves to imagine and to wonder while staying grounded in what we know. And perhaps the journey itself is the point. Perhaps the value is not in reaching a destination but in the traveling, in the questions we ask, in the imagination we exercise, in the empathy we develop for people distant from us in time, in the perspective we gain on our own moment and our own place in the long story. As you prepare to drift towards sleep, or as you continue through your day or night, wherever you are, carry with you if you wish this sense of connection, of being part of something ancient and ongoing. Carry the knowledge that humans have always faced challenges, always adapted, always told stories, always sought meaning. Carry the reminder that impermanence is not tragedy but simply the nature of things, and that within impermanence there is still beauty, still value, still the possibility of wisdom and kindness and joy. The flood, if it happened as we've imagined, was both an ending and a beginning. So too with every ending in our own lives. When something is lost, space is created for something new. When we let go of certainty, we make room for wonder. When we acknowledge how much we don't know, we open ourselves to learning. These are gentle lessons, offered softly, without insistence, like the lapping of waves on a shore. If there were people who watched the waters rise, who gathered what they could carry and moved to higher ground, who told their children about the lands they had left behind, they survived through courage and adaptation and mutual support. They grieved what was lost, but they continued living. They found new homes, made new patterns, told new stories that incorporated the old ones. They didn't forget. Memory is tenacious, but neither did they remain frozen in the past. They moved forward, because that's what life requires. We honor them, those possible ancestors on the drowned lands, by doing the same. By facing our own challenges with courage and creativity. By adapting when we must while preserving what we can. By telling our stories honestly, including the losses and the uncertainties. By taking care of each other and of the world we inhabit. By finding meaning and beauty even in impermanence, even in incompleteness, even in the mysteries that remain unsolved. The waters that covered the old lands still flow, still follow their cycles from ocean to sky to rain to river to ocean again. The carbon atoms that made up the bodies of Ice Age humans are still here, incorporated now into other life forms, into the air, into the soil, into us. Nothing is truly lost, everything transforms. Energy and matter cannot be destroyed, only changed. And perhaps the same is true, in some less literal sense, for knowledge, for culture, for the human spirit. Nothing is truly lost. Everything transforms, continues in new forms, influences what comes after in ways we might not even recognize. So rest now, in this soft certainty, that you are part of the pattern, woven into it inextricably. That your ancestors survived impossible things and here you are as proof. That the challenges you face, whether large or small, are not unprecedented in the scope of human experience. That adaptation and resilience are your birthright, inherited from countless generations who faced their own floods, their own catastrophes, their own losses, and who continued nonetheless. The flood myths tell us that after the waters recede, life returns. Plants grow, animals appear, humans build again. The world is renewed. This is not just mythological optimism. It's observed reality. Ecosystems recover from disasters. Species adapt or migrate or evolve. Humans are remarkably creative at finding ways to survive and thrive even in difficult circumstances. We have always been this way. We carry this capacity within us. And so the story continues, our story, the human story, the story that includes the people on the drowned lands and the people who came before them and all of us who have come after and all who will come in the future. It's a long story, full of chapters we don't know and can't read, full of mysteries and losses and unexpected turns. But it's our story, and we're part of it, and that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. The gentle rhythm of waves, the patient cycling of water, the slow turning of the earth, the ancient dance of ice and ocean, the rising and the falling, the building and the losing, the remembering and the forgetting, the light and the dark, the waking and the sleeping, all of these continue, have always continued, will always continue. And within these great cycles, our small lives unfold, bright and brief and precious. May you rest well, traveler. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the soft sound of distant waters and the whisper of old stories. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you whatever meanings or images or feelings have settled into your heart during this journey through time and imagination. May you move through your days with the knowledge that you are connected to something vast and ancient, that you belong to the long lineage of humanity, that your life matters even in its brevity, that your story is part of the greater story. The people on the drowned lands, if they existed, are gone now. Their cities, if they had cities, are beneath the waves. Their knowledge, if they had sophisticated knowledge, is largely lost. But they lived. They were here. They experienced sunrises and storms, joy and sorrow, the the full range of human feeling. They loved their children and honored their elders and created beauty and sought truth as best they understood it. They were real, and they matter, whether or not we ever find evidence of them, whether or not we ever know their names or their stories. And the same will be true of us, someday, to people looking back from some unimaginable future. We will be the mysterious ancestors, the ones who lived in a time they can barely reconstruct, the ones they wonder about and imagine and perhaps idealize or perhaps misunderstand. We will be the people whose time on Earth was real and full and complex, even though the traces we leave behind might be fragmentary and puzzling. So live well, dear listener. Love deeply. Create beauty. Seek truth. Tell stories. Take care of each other and of the world. Not because these things will last forever. They won't, but because they are worth doing, because they are what it means to be human, because in the doing of them we participate in something larger than ourselves, something that connects us backward to all our ancestors and forward to all our descendants. The waters rise and fall. Lands appear and disappear. Ice ages come and go. Civilizations bloom and fade. But the human spirit persists, adapting, creating, remembering, always reaching towards something just beyond our grasp, always trying to understand, always building meaning from the raw materials of existence. If you listen very carefully, in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, perhaps you can hear them, the voices of those who came before, carried on currents of water and wind and story. They're not speaking words exactly, nothing so clear as that, but there's a resonance, a vibration in the deep places of memory that we all share. They're telling us that they lived, that they mattered, that they faced their challenges as we face ours, that they found joy despite uncertainty, that they loved despite knowing everything ends. And we respond, across the gulf of time, not with words but with our living. Every time we tell a story, every time we adapt to change, every time we preserve something worth preserving or let go of something that no longer serves, every time we face difficulty with courage or offer kindness to another person, we are answering them. We are saying, we hear you, we remember you, we carry forward what you began, we honor you by continuing the work of being human. The archaeologists will keep searching, and that is good. They will map more of the seafloor, conduct more underwater surveys, apply new technologies to old questions. Perhaps they will find clear evidence of sophisticated Ice Age coastal cultures. Perhaps they will find something that changes our understanding of human history. Or perhaps the evidence will remain elusive, scattered, ambiguous. Either way, the search itself is valuable. The asking of questions is valuable. The willingness to challenge assumptions and consider new possibilities is valuable. But we don't need to wait for definitive answers to find meaning in the question. The question itself teaches us. It teaches us humility, reminding us how much we don't know, how incomplete our picture of the past is. It teaches us to think in deep time, to consider the long arc of human experience rather than focusing only on the slice of time we can directly observe. It teaches us about impermanence and change, about the way that even the ground beneath our feet is not as permanent as it seems. And it teaches us about resilience, about the remarkable capacity of humans to survive and adapt and continue creating meaning even through catastrophic change. If the people on the drowned lands existed and were displaced by rising seas, they survived. They had to leave behind places and things that mattered to them, had to adapt to new environments, had to rebuild their lives in circumstances they hadn't chosen. And they did it. Their descendants are us. We carry their survival in our very existence. This is not just ancient history. Displacement by environmental change is happening now, in our own time. Coastal communities are already experiencing the effects of rising sea levels. Island nations are considering what it means to be a nation when your territory is disappearing beneath the waves. Climate refugees are already a reality, and their numbers will grow. The story of the drowned lands is not just about the past, it's about a pattern that repeats, about a human experience that transcends particular times and places. How we respond to these challenges matters. The choices we make. About how to adapt infrastructure, how to welcome displaced populations, how to preserve cultural knowledge and practices when communities are scattered, how to maintain social cohesion through difficult transitions. These choices will shape what kind of ancestors we become to future generations. Will we be remembered as people who faced reality clearly and responded with wisdom and compassion? Or as people who looked away, who prioritized short-term convenience over long-term sustainability, who allowed fear and division to prevent effective action? The flood myths, with their emphasis on preparation and survival and the preservation of knowledge, offer a kind of template. The stories honor those who pay attention to signs of coming danger, who warn others even when the warning is unwelcome, who take action to preserve life and knowledge, who maintain hope and purpose through catastrophe. These are archetypal roles, and they're available to us. We can be the ones who pay attention, who warn, who preserve, who maintain hope. Or we can be the ones who ignore the signs until it's too late. But let us not burden ourselves too heavily with these weighty considerations. Let us return to the gentler current of meditation, to the soft contemplation of water and time and the mysteries that remain mysterious. There is a place for urgency and action, but there is also a place for quiet reflection, for simply sitting with what is and what was and what might have been. Picture, if you will, a coastline at dawn, neither in our time nor in the deep past but in some liminal space between. The sky is lightening from black to deep blue to pale gold. The water is calm, barely rippling, reflecting the emerging light. The sand, if it is sand, is smooth, unmarked by footprints. There is a quality of expectancy, of potential, as if the world is holding its breath before beginning the day's work. And perhaps, just at the edge of vision, there are figures. Not clear enough to see distinctly, but there, definitely there. People walking along the shore, going about their morning routines. Checking fishing nets, perhaps, or gathering shellfish, or simply walking, enjoying the cool air before the day grows warm. They are our ancestors, or our cousins in time, or reflections of some possibility that exists in the space between history and imagination. They don't see us, we are as invisible to them as they are uncertain to us. But we can see them, or feel their presence, or imagine them with enough clarity that the distinction between seeing and imagining blurs. They are content, in this moment. Whatever challenges they face, whatever knowledge they carry, whatever their lives hold of struggle or joy, in this moment they are simply here, walking on this beach, alive in this dawn. And then the image fades, as such images do, dissolving back into the general mystery of the past. We can't hold on to it, can't make it clearer or more certain than it is. We can only acknowledge that it was there, or might have been there, or that we felt something reaching across time toward us, or that we reached across time toward something, and that this reaching, this gesture toward connection with the past, is itself meaningful. The philosopher George Santayana wrote that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's a famous quote, often cited, but what does it mean in the context we're exploring? If the past is partially unknown, if whole chapters of it are lost or obscure, how can we remember it? And what would it mean to repeat it? Perhaps the deeper meaning is not about remembering specific events but about recognizing patterns, understanding the fundamental dynamics that shape human experience across time. The specific details of Ice Age cultures might be lost, but the pattern of environmental change affecting human societies, that pattern is clear enough. The specific knowledge systems they developed might be gone, but the principle that knowledge must be actively preserved or it will be lost, that principle remains valid. The particular stories they told might be unrecoverable, but the importance of story itself, of narrative as a way of making sense of experience and transmitting wisdom, that importance is obvious. So perhaps remembering the past is less about recovering every detail and more about understanding the underlying truths, the patterns that persist even when the specifics change. And perhaps avoiding the repetition of past mistakes is less about preventing any particular event from recurring and more about learning wisdom, developing the capacity to recognize warning signs, building resilience and adaptability into our systems and ourselves. The drowned lands teach us, if we let them, about the power of gradual change that becomes catastrophic, about the importance of paying attention to what's happening even when the changes seem small, about the need to adapt before we're forced to, about the value of community and cooperation in facing challenges too large for individuals to handle alone. These lessons are abstract, perhaps, but they can become concrete when we apply them to our own lives and times. What gradual changes are we ignoring that might become catastrophic? What knowledge are we failing to preserve or transmit? What communities are we neglecting to support or strengthen? What adaptations should we be making now, before crisis forces our hand? These are questions worth sitting with, worth turning over in our minds in the quiet spaces of reflection. But again, let us not make this too heavy, too demanding. There is wisdom in action, yes, but there is also wisdom in rest, in allowing the mind to wander, in trusting that understanding deepens not just through effort but through the gentle percolation of ideas in the unconscious mind. Sleep itself is a kind of learning, a time when the brain processes and integrates information, when insights arise unbidden, when the connections form that elude us in our waking efforts. So if you're drifting towards sleep now, let yourself drift. Let these stories and images and ideas settle into whatever part of your mind receives them. Don't try to hold onto them or analyze them or extract lessons from them. Just let them be, let them do whatever work they need to do in their own time and their own way. The conscious mind has done its part, now let the deeper processes take over. And if you're awake, alert, engaged, that's fine too. Let your mind play with these ideas, make its own connections, wander down its own paths of association. There's no correct way to receive these stories, no particular response that's required. The offering is simply the story itself, the images, the wondering, the invitation to think about time and change and humanity in a slightly different way than you might have before. The water continues its ancient rhythms, indifferent to our thoughts about it but also, in a way, the medium of those thoughts. Water is in us, around us, moving through us constantly. We are mostly water, held together temporarily in human form. The water that makes up your body right now has been cycling through the Earth system for billions of years. Some of those molecules might have been in the Ice Age oceans, might have fallen as snow on the great glaciers, might have been drunk by the people on the drowned lands, might have been part of the floods that displaced them. There's continuity in that, physical continuity across vast spans of time. The same atoms, the same molecules, endlessly recycled, taking different forms but never created or destroyed. You are made of ancient stuff, stardust and seawater, and when your body eventually breaks down, that stuff will continue, will become part of other things, other beings, will continue the great circulation. This is not mysticism, it's simple chemistry and physics. But it has a kind of poetic resonance, doesn't it? We are not separate from the world but part of it, made of it, participants in cycles that preceded us and will continue after us. Our individual consciousness might be unique, might experience itself as separate and distinct, but at the material level we're continuous with everything else, part of the great web of matter and energy that makes up the physical universe. And perhaps there's a psychological or spiritual continuity as well, harder to define or prove but no less real in its way. The basic structures of human consciousness, the fundamental emotions and drives and capacities, these are inherited from our ancestors going back not just thousands but millions of years. The ability to feel love, to experience awe, to seek meaning, to create beauty, to cooperate with others, to imagine possibilities beyond the immediate present, these are not cultural inventions but deep features of what it means to be human. So when we imagine the people on the drowned lands, we're not imagining aliens, not creatures fundamentally different from ourselves. We're imagining people who felt as we feel, thought as we think, hoped and feared as we hope and fear. The surface details of their lives were different, different technologies, different cultural forms, different specific beliefs and practices. But underneath, at the level of basic human experience, they were us and we're them. There is no fundamental discontinuity. This recognition of common humanity across time can be a source of comfort and connection. You are not alone, not really. You are part of a lineage stretching back unimaginably far, part of a project that has been ongoing for hundreds of thousands of years. Your struggles are not unique, not unprecedented. Others have faced similar challenges, have felt similar feelings, have asked similar questions. And they survived, they adapted, they found ways to continue. You carry their survival in your genes, in your capabilities, in the very fact of your existence. And you are also connected forward, to all the people who will come after you, who will inherit the world you helped shape, who will look back at your time and wonder about it as we wonder about the past. You are a link in the chain, both recipient and transmitter, both heir and ancestor. What you do matters, not because it will last forever, it won't, but because it affects what comes next, because it's part of the ongoing story. The flood, whether literal or metaphorical, whether an actual event or a symbolic representation of change and loss, is not the end of the story. It's a chapter, an episode, a transition. After the flood comes the rebuilding, the adaptation, the continuation. Life finds a way, as the saying goes. Humans find a way. We always have. And in the finding of the way, in the continuing despite loss, in the adapting to new circumstances, in the preserving of what can be preserved and the letting go of what cannot, in the telling of stories that help us make sense of it all, in all of this, we discover something essential about ourselves. We discover that we are resilient, creative, capable of much more than we might have thought. We discover that meaning is not something given to us by circumstances but something we create through how we respond to circumstances. We discover that even in loss there can be wisdom, even in endings there can be grace. The drowned lands are gone, if they ever existed as we've imagined them. We cannot visit them, cannot walk their shores, cannot meet the people who lived there. But in another sense, they are not gone at all. They are present in the stories, in the questions, in the patterns they help us recognize, in the memories they might have left encoded in myth and tradition. They are present in our contemplation of them, in our willingness to wonder about them, in our recognition that the past is larger than we can fully know. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery itself is valuable, the not knowing that keeps us curious, keeps us humble, keeps us open to surprise and discovery. If we knew everything, if the past were completely transparent to us, something would be lost. The imagination needs space to work, needs gaps to fill, needs mystery to explore. The questions that have no definitive answers are often the most fruitful questions, the ones that generate the most thought, the most insight, the most growth. So let the drowned lands remain partially mysterious. Let the flood myths keep their ambiguity, their multiple possible meanings. Let the past be both knowable and unknowable, both clear and obscure, both history and story. This is not a failure of knowledge but a feature of reality. Some things can be known precisely, others can only be known approximately, suggestively, poetically. And that's all right. That's how it should be. As we near the end of this long meditation, this journey through time and possibility, let us gather the threads we've been following and see what pattern they make, not a conclusion but a resting place, not an answer but a gesture toward understanding. We began with the question, what if a great flood erased an earlier advanced civilization? We've explored the geological reality of sea level rise following the last ice age, the submergence of vast coastal regions that were once dry land. We've considered the capacity of oral traditions to preserve historical memories across impressive time spans. We've looked at the worldwide distribution of flood myths and wondered what they might mean. We've imagined what kinds of cultures might have existed on the drowned lands, and what might have been lost when those lands were submerged. We've been careful to distinguish between what we know and what we imagine, between documented evidence and informed speculation. We've acknowledged the skepticism of mainstream archaeology toward claims of lost advanced civilizations, while also recognizing that the underwater realm remains largely unexplored and that surprises are still possible. We've tried to walk a middle path between credulity and closed-mindedness, between accepting every dramatic claim and dismissing every interesting possibility. But beyond the specific question, we've also been meditating on larger themes: impermanence and change, loss and continuity, the fragility of knowledge, the resilience of the human spirit, the long arc of human history, our connection to ancestors we cannot know and descendants we will never meet. These themes are not just historical or archaeological, they're existential, touching on fundamental questions about what it means to be human, about how we find meaning in a world where nothing lasts forever. And we've done this in a particular way, not with urgency or drama, but with gentleness, with a slow unfolding, with attention to rhythm and flow, with the intention of creating not just information transfer but an experience, a space for reflection, perhaps even an aid to rest and sleep. Because sometimes the most important thing is not to learn specific facts but to spend time with ideas in a contemplative way, to let them work on us at a level deeper than conscious analysis. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, whether awake or drifting in and out of sleep, whether focused intently on every word or letting the words wash over you like waves, I hope you've found something of value here. Perhaps a new perspective on human history. Perhaps a sense of connection to the deep past. Perhaps simply a peaceful hour or two, a respite from the demands of the present, a quiet space in which to rest. And if you've fallen asleep somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine, perhaps even ideal. Sleep is not a failure to pay attention but a natural and necessary state, one in which the mind continues its work in different ways. The stories and ideas you heard before sleep may influence your dreams, may be processed and integrated in ways that conscious listening wouldn't achieve. There is wisdom in the body's rhythms, in the cycling between waking and sleeping, in the need for rest as much as for activity. As we close, let me offer one final image, one last scene to carry with you into sleep or into your waking hours. Picture the ocean at sunset, the light golden and soft, the water calm, the horizon line clear and sharp. Somewhere beneath that water, beneath the waves and the fathoms, beneath the sediments accumulated over thousands of years, there might be traces of the people we've been imagining. A hearthstone, perhaps, darkened by ancient fires. A tool, carefully shaped, dropped and lost and buried. The remains of a structure, barely recognizable after millennia underwater. Or perhaps nothing at all, perhaps every trace has been scattered and dissolved and integrated back into the general stuff of the world. But whether the physical traces exist or not, the human reality exists. People lived, loved, struggled, created, wondered, told stories, raised children, grew old, died. They were as real as you are, as complex, as worthy of recognition and respect. And they are part of your lineage, part of the great human family that stretches back to our origin as a species and forward to whatever future awaits us. The sun sinks lower, touches the horizon, begins to slip beneath it. The light shifts from gold to red to purple. The first stars appear, the same stars that ancient peoples navigated by, the same stars that will shine long after we're gone. The water darkens, becomes mysterious, a surface hiding depths. And somewhere in those depths, in the darkness and the silence and the slow currents, the past rests, neither wholly lost nor wholly recoverable, neither entirely gone nor fully present, but there, always there, patient and enduring and full of secrets we may never fully uncover. And that's all right. That's exactly as it should be. The mystery is part of the gift, the not knowing that keeps us wondering, the questions that have no final answers but endless approaches. We live in the questions, make our homes in the space between certainty and ignorance, find our way forward not by having all the answers but by staying curious, staying humble, staying open to surprise. So rest now, dear traveler. You've come a long way through time tonight, visited distant places and pondered deep questions. Let it all settle, let it integrate, let it become part of you in whatever way it's meant to. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and opportunities, its own questions and mysteries. But for now, this moment, this breath, this gentle fading of light and consciousness into darkness and rest, this is enough. This is everything. The waters rise and fall, the ice advances and retreats, the coastlines shift and change, and through it all, human life continues, adapting, persisting, creating meaning from chaos, finding beauty in impermanence, telling stories that bind past and present and future together in a continuity that transcends any individual life or civilization. You are part of this. You belong to this. And in belonging to it, you are never truly alone, never without ancestors, never without purpose. Simply being here, being human, being part of the ongoing story, this is enough. This is your inheritance and your gift, received from the past and offered to the future, a link in the chain that stretches beyond sight in both directions. Sleep well, or wake well, whichever you need. The world will turn, the sun will rise, the waters will continue their ancient dance. And you will be here, part of it all, brief and precious and exactly where you belong. The flood, if it happened, is long past. What remains is life, is possibility, is the continuing conversation between humans and the world we inhabit, between our need for meaning and the vast, beautiful, mysterious universe that gave us birth and will receive us back in time. Thank you for listening, for wondering, for allowing yourself to drift through these stories and reflections. Thank you for your presence, your attention, your willingness to contemplate the mysteries of the past. May you find rest in the not knowing, peace in the questioning, and gentle comfort in the recognition that you are part of something ancient and ongoing, something worthy of awe. The drowned lands sleep beneath the waves, and we sleep beneath the stars, and in our sleeping and our waking we are all connected, all part of the great pattern, all brief bright moments in the long story of being. And that story, vast as it is, needs every moment, every life, every small act of courage or kindness or creation. Your part matters, even if you never know how it matters, even if no trace of you survives 10,000 years from now. You matter because you are here, because you are human, because you carry forward the ancient capacity for wonder and love and meaning-making that has sustained our species through every challenge, every disaster, every loss. You are the answer to the question of whether humanity continues, whether consciousness persists, whether the story goes on. By your very existence, by your living, you answer, yes. And so we end where all the best stories end, not with final resolution but with continuation, not with certainty but with possibility, not with an ending but with an opening toward whatever comes next. The night is deep, the waters are quiet, the ancient mysteries remain mysterious. And that is well. That is very well indeed. Rest now, in the company of all who have ever wondered about the past or dreamed of the future. Rest in the certainty that you are not alone, that you belong to something larger than yourself, that your brief time here is woven into a pattern that predates you and will continue after you. Rest in peace, in wholeness, in the gentle embrace of time and water and the enduring human spirit. Good night, traveler. Thank you for this journey. May the tides of sleep carry you gently, and may you wake refreshed, carrying whatever gifts this night has offered, ready to write your own small part of the continuing story. The flood is past, the lands are drowned, but we remain, we persist, we continue. And in that continuation is all the hope and meaning anyone could need. The waters whisper their ancient song, and in their whisper is the voice of everyone who has ever lived, everyone who has ever wondered, everyone who has ever hoped. And now that voice includes yours, added to the great chorus, brief but real, temporary but eternal in its having been. You are the proof that the story continues, that the flood was not the end, that human consciousness endures, adapts, and creates meaning from the raw materials of existence. Sleep now. Dream well. The drowned lands hold their secrets, and you hold yours, and together we hold the future, whatever it may bring. Good night.